Um, thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We are so delighted to have Cecilia Muñoz joining us here to talk about lessons that we can learn about public tech and leadership. My name is Nigella Nakuna. I am a dual degree student at the Harvard Kennedy School and MIT Sloan School of Management. Public interest tech has always interested me. I come from a tech background and I really love just learning about how tech and products can scale processes and systems that generate socioeconomic mobility for different communities. And then I just have a couple of reminders for us here today. The first is that this event is being recorded. The second is just please make sure to share questions in the Q&A. We'd love if everyone could participate actively, so feel free to use the chat and generate discussion there as well. We're super excited for this event and we want it to be a conversation. The third is just remembering that we are adhering to the Harvard Code of Conduct, so please make sure that the conversation or questions and comments are respectful. And the last is, given this is being hosted by the Shorenstein Center, we wanted to remind everyone that if you wanted to learn more about the center, you can subscribe to the newsletter in the link in the chat, which I'll place in there, and also on our website. With that, I'll turn it back over to Kathy to kick off the event.
Thank you, Nigella. You all, I thank you for being here and spending your afternoon, evening, morning, night, wherever you are in the world with us. I was so excited to be able to even get the opportunity to read about Cecilia's life and work and impact over the last 3+ decades, and was really honored to be able to host you, Cecilia, here at the Harvard Shorenstein, quote, at the Harvard Shorenstein Center, and learn from your years of work in the nonprofit sector, in the Obama White House, building out a whole new public interest technology movement at New America, and sharing so much of your story around how you've done the work and weaved it in with your life. And thank you for being here. I have a list of questions that I will kick off after Cecilia does her 10-15-minute talk, but please put questions into chat and into Q&A as well, and we'll try to make this as webinar interactive as possible. And also, if you have anything along the way that you want to share your own experiences and your own stories, please pop that into chat as well. We'd love to hear from you too. So with that, Cecilia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nigella, Kathy. I'm quite honored to be here. I'm quite grateful to everybody who joined. And I should say that Kathy Pham is one of my heroes, so it's particularly special to me. So thank you for pulling this together, and thanks for everybody for joining in. And this is one of those rare moments where I get to indulge my woman of color who works in policy self, which is really kind of me for the last 30+ years, and also my advocate for public interest technology self, which is a more recent phenomenon, and that's how I got to know Kathy. So as you heard, I've been what I think of as a policy nerd pretty much my entire career. I joined a group that was then called the National Council of La Raza. It's now called Unidos US in 1988. That's when I came to Washington. And I left to join the Obama White House in 2009. And I came to New America after I was in the Obama White House for 8 years, and came to New America to work on public interest tech after that. And I wrote this book, More Than Ready, not so much as a chronicle of my career overall, but as a recounting of things that I learned as a woman of color in these roles, where I was often the first Latina in a particular job, often the only woman in the room, regularly the only person of color in the room. And my hope was that what I learned from these experiences would be useful, particularly to other women, and especially to other women of color. So I'll talk a little bit, and I know Kathy and I will have a conversation about the ways that I feel like I've been tested And I'll talk about the other women of color that I spoke to when preparing the book and the strategies that we all develop to address the challenges that we face. But I also know that this is might be a somewhat tech-focused crowd, and I have a particular story to tell that I hope will be of use to this particular audience. So I should say I think of myself now as a technologist. I didn't think of myself as that until relatively recently, and I still sometimes wonder whether that's a title that I can give myself. I'm not a person who codes, but I am somebody who works in the tech sector as a policy person who understands the importance of what I think of as bringing the tech skill set into making and implementing public policy. I'm one of the people from the Obama administration who was just completely evangelized by the experience of watching the healthcare.gov website fail spectacularly and then get fixed spectacularly. I'd like to point out that like 20 million people did get healthcare as a result of that effort. And that was done by a set of folks who demonstrated that our problems were not engineering problems. They were about the fact that the government doesn't manage projects on this scale particularly well. And in the same way that we are this moment struggling to get unemployment insurance dollars out the door or vaccinations into people's arms, this feels really, really important. This notion of delivering what the government promises to the people it is intended for is essential. So as a policymaker, not surprisingly, I care hugely about whether the policies that are the results of our bright ideas actually get delivered to the people that they're intended for. Too often, and I say this on a day knowing that this is a day in which the President of the United States has just signed a huge bill that is an enormous victory for all kinds of reasons. But too frequently, we celebrate the policy victory when the bill passes, as if the existence of the policy were good enough. And that's often in the face of evidence that millions of people ultimately don't access the things that we intended. So this is the same country that effectively invented all of the tech innovations that have changed our lives. So it's an unacceptable outcome, and it is totally fixable. I have learned to say, or I've learned not to say that technology is really what's needed to fix government delivery of things, because I've learned it's not actually technology that we need, it's technologists. And the skill sets that they bring to these kinds of tasks are actually the missing ingredient. So that when we design, say, the child tax credit, which is like maybe the most important piece of this bill, which just got signed into law, it's going to reduce child poverty in half in the United States if we implement it well. But it's important to employ the techniques of user-centered design, data instrumentation, not just when we're attempting to implement a new law like this. Ideally, we should deploy those skills when we're designing the policy in the first place. So my skill set is the policy skill set. And I have enough humility to know that I need the user-centered design skill set, the data instrumentation skill sets like this at the table with me if the policy I design is going to succeed. So that insight as a policymaker is what led me to New America, which is where I work with a wonderful team that's working to build a field of public interest technology. And our goal is to arrive at a day when this is a thing you can study and train to do, much as you can study to become a public interest lawyer, and that people in governments and in NGOs will hire you because they know they need you to be successful. So this is enormously important, and it goes to the question also of what it's like to be so frequently the first Latina in a particular role or the only woman in the room, because we see so many examples of technology that doesn't succeed or that causes terrible problems because there's no diversity in the room when things get designed. I recently responded to a post on Twitter from an academic who was outraged that his daughter had to go to huge lengths to get the program on her computer that was proctoring the exam that she was taking to actually register that she was sitting at her computer because the technology couldn't see her because she was Black. That shouldn't happen. And it's hard to imagine that it could happen if the design tables had a diversity of people sitting at them. So this really goes to the essence of why I wrote this book. I was the first Hispanic person ever to be the domestic policy advisor to the president. Throughout my career, I was often the only woman in the room, the only Latino in the room. like so many of us, I was aware that sometimes the people around me were not so sure that I belonged at those tables and in those roles. And I allowed their doubts to become my doubts. So at policy tables, at tech tables, not to mention corporate boards and C-suites, women are still too much of a rarity, and women of color are especially a rarity. So I wrote the book because too often we have to do backflips to remind ourselves that we belong in those rooms. And too many of us develop survival strategies alone, thinking that we're the only ones who are going through what we're going through. So I learned a lot about myself over the course of my career in the process of writing this book. I learned a lot about what holds me back, about what it takes to push myself forward with integrity, with effectiveness, and hopefully with kindness, which is important to me. And this is something that I write about. I interviewed 7 women of color who I admire when I wrote the book, and I learned we're all facing the same challenges. We think we're facing them alone, but we're not alone. We all devise strategies for those challenges, and they're very frequently the same strategies. We just don't talk about it. So my book is really, it's an effort to start the conversation. So with that, let me, I guess, turn back to Kathy to start a conversation in this virtual room.
Yes. All right, folks, if you want to put questions into the chat or the Q&A, I'd actually also love to bring you in live to ask your question as well. And we'll call on you near the end of this. So Cecilia, I yesterday had sent Cecilia this list of, when I read your book, I had taken all these notes, but there are way too many notes because I kept wanting to highlight everything. So I had sent over this list of, here are just a few key things that just really, really struck me, and I'll touch on a few of those, and would also just love to hear from the rest of you all as well. I first want to touch on, I'll share a few themes, then we can dive into each of those. I would definitely want to touch on the technologist piece of that, and also talk about your very pivotal role in making sure USCS even existed, and the importance of having someone in the room who understands so deeply policy and bureaucracy when a group of technologists with none of those try to get something off the ground. And also you touched upon in the last few minutes this idea of your lived experiences and all that you brought to the table, and the immense value. There was a section in your book where you talked about realizing this immense value that you bring to the table, not just the folks in DCs with their suits and a particular kind of training, but the immense value you brought to the table first for being who you are and the experiences that you had to this work that was so critical in Washington, DC, as well as this mix of understanding kindness and weakness that was this theme across these 7 women you also interviewed. And I think that's something that so many women in power end up grappling with, this idea of kindness equals weakness, or if you're not kind, maybe you're a bully, and to even think through that. And then also find you shared so much about your abuelita and your family and your mom, and how there was one line there too that really struck, which was you were surrounded by powerful women, but not necessarily women in the workforce.
Yeah.
And oh, how so many people from either immigrant families or others can resonate, where these women, at least in my family, who've lived through wars, who'd gone through so much, but at the same time, we're not necessarily in the workforce. So you have this example of power, but not necessarily the workforce. So I wanted to raise those just for other folks to think through your questions. But let's start by diving into the technologist piece. I think quite a few folks in the audience are also from policy backgrounds as well, or have an interest in tech. And I really first just want to emphasize, I hadn't met Cecilia for the longest time. When I first started working at the White House, had just come from somewhere in the private sector. And I just remember over and over again hearing your name come up as the person that made things happen for us, for the US Digital Service, for this group of techies in government, when the techies were the ones that were getting all this press and, Wired and Fast Company of like coming to government. But it was really folks like you and your teams that have made it possible. And I think there was a section in your book as well that you talked about You are the person that really helped decide where these digital service teams would go. How would we know? We knew nothing about government. And so just to dive more into that, you definitely 100% are a technologist. Not that you need me to tell you that, Celia. But really, what is that like? Even the journey to calling yourself a technologist, but the significant influence you've had on making it possible for anyone with any technology, quote, or engineering background to do any work in the government setting.
So there's actually a story. I've heard people say that, like, I had, so a light bulb over my head kind of moment that kind of changed everything. And I remember the moment exactly, but I had no idea that that's what was happening at the time. So as you heard, like, I'm a policy nerd. Like, that's really what I do. But I actually attribute this to having grown up in a family. I'm the youngest of four siblings, and my sister and brothers are scientists. In fact, both of my brothers are in the tech industry. And dinner table conversations were about stuff that they were interested in, because I was the baby. I wasn't going to be driving the conversation. So I got very comfortable engaging in conversations with people who knew more about certain things than I did, right? Because I'm, 11, 6, and 5 years younger than my siblings. And so that's actually very comfortable for me. So I end up in this situation where we're like at the table with folks with tech expertise. And the specifics of this story is that the President Obama had asked his team to come up with some additional ideas on making college affordable. Right? We had actually passed a whole bunch of policy that was actually very effective in getting resources to students and in making college more affordable in a variety of ways. But he was very eager to do more. And he basically sent his domestic policy council team on an effort to come up with new ideas. And the idea that he got really excited about was this notion of college scorecard, right? That would compete with US News and World Report, which does a scorecard, which frankly measures all of the wrong things. And he wanted to create this notion that that you could measure, that you should have at least as much data and information when you're making a decision about where to go to school as you do when you're buying a refrigerator or a car, right? That you should have some level of data rather than just the marketing that happens. And we set about, and in his mind, that was going to live on a website. So we set about using the data that the government has available to create this thing. And we had a problem with the data, which was initially why I said, well, we've got these digital teams. They must know how to fix that. So let's bring them in. So we did. We brought in a digital team, and they worked on the college scorecard, and they helped fix the data problem. But more importantly, they started talking to 17-year-olds who were the target audience for this product that we were developing. And, they did a little user-centered design. And my deputy came into my office and said, these digital people are like, the president wants a website and they're telling us we should do something different, and you gotta talk to them. So I had them in, and they went through a slide deck that showed, we did some user-centered design. We talked to some 17-year-olds, and this tool that you think they're going to use, they didn't use it. But you know what they were interested in? This and this and this and this. So they basically said, look, you can put this scorecard on a website if that's what the president wants you to do. But actually, we think you should release the data, invite some developers to play with it and see what they develop, because this data will live that way in a bunch of different innovative approaches that students will ultimately use. And the light bulb moment was that I realized that they made sense, right? And that's not because I had tech skills necessarily, but it is because I care a lot about whether the policy product that we are developing is actually going to make a meaningful difference in the lives of the people in question, who in this case are 17-year-olds. So evidently that meeting was one of the first breakthrough moments where, like, what the digital teams could do became clear to one of the policy nerds who normally doesn't understand what it is the digital people are talking about. And that opened the door. We actually ended up producing a much different product than the president had envisioned. And by the way, it is still in use, and millions of people still use this data in a variety of innovative ways because of that suggestion by the digital team. But it also helped me realize, oh, this is a skill set that nobody else on my team has. And for all of our really good intentions, we are guessing as to what's going to work. And we don't have to guess because there's a way to find out what will actually reach the people that we are aiming at. So that was a breakthrough for me, and it turns out to have been a breakthrough for the US Digital Service. But then I got to help place these teams where we had big problems that needed fixing or big challenges that we need to confront. And the stories of what they were able to accomplish are breathtaking. And I came out of that experience realizing that we really need this capacity in government at every level.
Thank you, Cecilia. We talk so much about needing champions in government when we, come in with certain ideas that we want to implement. And it's so great to hear that story and the college scorecard with Lisa Golofter and Erie Meyer and others who really shipped that off the ground, bringing in the data-driven ideas and design to the federal government. Thank you for sharing that story. I know I get a lot of questions, especially from the students around, what are the best ways to get involved in government and technology with various different backgrounds that they have. And it's so great to hear that's a really, that's one example of a great way to get involved. Let me ask one more, and then maybe we can turn it over to at least Catherine and Alejandro, who have 2 questions to ask as well. I'll lump together the lived experiences one. I just so appreciated reading this section around, there is a path that is deemed, you have all these credentials and you end up in these places. And then there are people with these lived experiences who really bring such immense value to an organization, and you called that out. And you also, I think by writing your book, in the beginning of your book, just in the first few pages, you had talked about the nuance of the term Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Hispanic, and really calling that out as really a sensitive topic or just this idea that it's not a homogenous group and we really have to understand these words. And I kept thinking, even in tech, if every person who built technologies or policy understood the nuance of all of this, because we had people in the room to understand what world that would look like. So can you talk to us more about what you're thinking when you're writing this and just your experience with that as well?
So I've learned that in the 20 years I was at the National Council de la Raza, it's now called Unidos US. I mean, what I was doing was making sure that policymakers took into account the experience of my community when they were making policy that was going to affect us. And I was, most of my career, I've been doing that at a time when we were totally invisible as a community. So we had to do a lot of explaining, like, this is who we are. We didn't all just get here yesterday. And, we speak English pretty well, because there wasn't an assumption that people made. And I realized in a weird way, that's kind of sort of, maybe primitive user-centered design for policy, right? Just explaining the experience of a community and applying that to the policy conversation is really essential. We now have, thanks to the tech sector, much more sophisticated tools to allow us to engage communities. And you would not design a product without understanding who your customer base was going to be, because it doesn't work. And so the tech sector has developed ways to get inside our heads, to gather information about who people are and how they engage with the things that the tech sector is producing. That's all a set of skills that we invented in this country. We could apply those skills to policymaking, so that, for example, if you're developing the policy that's going to issue stimulus checks to people, right? That's the law that the president is signing today, but there was an earlier version of it called the CARES Act. My colleagues at New America, Tara McGinnis in particular, found there are still today 9 million people who never got their resources under the CARES Act. And part of the reason for that is that when we were developing the policy and designing the implementation, there wasn't a conversation about who the people were who were most in need of those resources. If there had been such a conversation, they would have found that many of those people don't earn enough income to pay taxes, and therefore the IRS isn't the best mechanism to reach them. So we helped, right? So a pipeline that goes from the IRS's data to people misses a lot of people. And then when we brought that to the attention of the IRS and they created a workaround, we looked at the impact of the workaround on the same people and found that it barred them, I don't think this was intentional, but it ended up keeping them from claiming the earned income tax credit, which is another source of resources, and in fact, a larger source of resources than the original benefit under the CARES Act. So all of which is to say, if spending a little time engaging with the population that a policy is aimed at, and it doesn't have to be in an ultra sophisticated way, can be essential to designing a policy that's actually going to reach people. And that's just applying user-centered design to the policy context. It's not rocket science. It doesn't involve like building the app that's going to save America, right? It just means applying a set of techniques that are commonplace in the tech sector, that are not commonplace in the policy sector, and which really need to be, because the people who get left behind frequently have the same characteristics. They're economically marginalized. They are frequently people of color. They are communities without broadband access. You know, look at who's able to access vaccines and who is not able to access vaccines. And the fact that in most parts of the country, you have to access it online. We already know who's going to get left out. And you don't have to build a policy structure in a way which excludes people. And in fact, if you're trying to preserve the public health, you can't build an infrastructure that excludes people. And you know, it doesn't take a lot of digging to determine exactly who's going to get left behind. And there's no reason we can't fix that.
So as you're talking, I can't help but just think of how you're able to bridge together all the nuance of policy and service delivery and product and bring all that understanding. Even the comment of, you know, if you're gonna put something online, we already know who's not going to have access. But actually a lot of people who don't know that's the case. They're like, we're just going to go online. Everyone will have access because they'll be online. And even just that understanding, being able to even just say that, you know, pretty casually is so important to bring together this intersection of, you know, services and product and policy. Yeah, and it just really struck me as you were talking that you just do that so well all the time.
Thank you. Well, it matters that we recognize ourselves as people who know stuff, right? In other words, coming from a community of color, coming from a community that's frequently marginalized, it's not rocket science to determine, like, we know folks who don't have broadband access. But we don't, that knowledge automatically is policy expertise, and it's relevant and it's valuable, but we don't always credit ourselves with being experts in a thing which is going to be useful. And we got to knock it off.
Thanks. All right, Catherine, I added you to the panelists. Do you want to ask your question out loud instead of just in chat?
Sure. Hi, and thank you guys so much for putting this together. So I think you've probably addressed a lot of the content and the context of the question, but it's just thinking of the US as in these stages of learning how to do tech and designing government well. And you had already pointed out, Cecilia, that there's rarely the end user who's actually part of the conversation and at the table. And so there's a lot of unintended consequences, sometimes unintentional, sometimes we don't know. And if we just think of how that translates to US foreign policy, there's a lot fewer protections, and the feedback loops for people to ask why decisions were made, what the priorities are, which companies get to be involved in the public-private partnerships that implement what are sort of publicly stated priorities of the US government. Those are all tenuous, and it seems that it's very difficult to spin up that kind of accountability pretty rapidly. So I'm just curious what you think the potential is, given how rapidly everything could be moving, to be able to weave that into technologist work and to external technologists who are helping governments, so that there can be a little bit more of an equitable approach in how government does public work globally.
And you mean,
Thanks.
so you mean governments around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the work that we're doing in in how to design a tech-driven government and data-driven and evidence-based government, it serves as a model for other governments around the world. So then they want to model us, but we also export experimentation on policies that maybe we would like to use domestically, but don't quite have the clearance for. And so how do we protect or do what we can to be good stewards in ensuring that we're mitigating as much harm as possible that's already underway?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I think I have a couple of colleagues, actually, Tara McGinnis and Hannah Schenk, who are coming out with a book next month called Power to the Public, which is focusing on public interest technology. And they make a really compelling case that at the center of doing this well is the practice of really focusing on design, on data, and delivery. And on those three pieces those are the three pieces that allow you to be kind of user focused, and to make sure that you're actually delivering a result for the folks in question. And so I'm pretty convinced that that those mechanisms are really essential, and that to the extent that we are engaging in this work in the United States, or the extent to which we are exporting it to in other countries, you have to be asking the question of the data that you're gathering. Like, why are you asking the questions that you're asking to gather data? What is that information going to be used for? Who's going to be using it? If the user is kind of at the beginning and the end of every piece of the process that you're doing, the more you emphasize that, the greater the likelihood that you're both going to be effective, and that you're going to be able to kind of move the equity issues in a positive direction rather than a negative direction. But you have to be asking the question continually, and you have to be constantly interrogating, like, what is it that we're trying to accomplish with this thing, and for whom, and what is it that gives us confidence that we will actually do it. And the reason that I've learned to talk about technologists more than about technology is that I'm really convinced that the minute you make technology the focus of the conversation, it becomes about what we can do, and that's not the same thing as what we can accomplish for people, which should really be at the center.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Let's do one more from Alejandro, and then we can move on with a few other questions. Alejandro, are you there?
Yes, you hear me?
We
Yes.
can.
Okay, thank you. Cecilia, as Latino, I am very proud of you. Yeah, it's just, you are the one of the main persons in the Latino community to show the value in our community. Thank you so much for being here. One of my question is, you are very important women right now, and you was very important in the government, the Obama government. What is your projection? What are your ideas about the future of our community after the pandemic? I think you had the big picture in our community, and you can see in different ways how we can affect in our community with the pandemic. Gracias.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Alejandro. I have a combination of kind of distress and optimism. So we're the largest minority in the country. Most of the country doesn't know that. And I have questions about how much of the country understands kind of how central to the country that we are. Like, we have a lot to do to understand our own history as a community, and to make sure that the rest of the country understands our history. So that feels very daunting to me, and I am haunted by the data around the pandemic and the extent to which, even within the same age groups, the data shows that African Americans and Latino, it's not just that we're more likely to get sick because we're more likely to work in either live in more crowded housing or work in sectors where we have to go into work and therefore are less protected from the virus. But even within the same age cohort, we're also more likely to die. And we're a lot more likely to die. And that's true of African Americans as well. So we've learned just a tremendous amount about these disparities and how impactful they are. And we just have such an enormously long way to go in order to address them, that feels daunting to me. What makes me feel hopeful is that we're the largest minority in the country. The country can't succeed economically unless we're succeeding economically. That's beginning to be better understood. And our political power is also only beginning to be better understood. And there is a wonderful, nuanced conversation being led by a couple of my former colleagues from the Obama administration named Stephanie Valencia and Carlos Odio. They run an organization called X and X Labs. And they are doing kind of deep dives into the sort of political data about the Latino community to understand the nuances better, because we're actually very diverse. And this most recent election has really highlighted some really important differences between subgroups, between regions, between genders in the Latino community. And that's really important. And it's really important to understand. It's really important that we understand it ourselves. It's really important that the political class understand it. So that I hope that we're on the verge of making a big leap in our own understanding of ourselves, as well as our ability to leverage power to, make our country a better place.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Cecilia. I'm going to ask one more question that maybe builds off on that. You mentioned this at lots of different places in your book, this idea of how you were able to get things done, despite sometimes some of the challenges, but also because of who you are and your background. There was a funny section in the beginning around literal sharp elbows to get into a room, but then you went on and talked about your different ways to get things done and people who inspired you. Can you talk more about that, different ways you found you were able to successfully get things done in various environments that you've led or worked in?
Yeah, so a lot of this for me boils down to both understanding myself as an expert, understanding my own authority, but also, and I get into this especially at the beginning of the book, being able to convey and project authority. And you can't see, because we're in a Zoom world in which people's height is not a thing. It's really very interesting. But, Kathy and I share the phenomenon that we're both petite women. I'm 5'2", right? So we've ended up having to use some elbows. And early on, when I was first in DC, now this was 30 years ago, and one would hope the situation would be different now, but I'm not convinced that it is. The immigration field, which is my area of deepest expertise, was dominated by men. They were mostly tall. And I describe a situation in a section called Sharp Elbows and Other Tools about being at a congressional hearing and having the guys kind of stand up and form a little circle, and I just couldn't get into the circle, and they were kind of making plans, and they were not malicious. No one was trying to exclude me, but they did exclude me. And I went back and complained to my boss, who is also a short person. And his advice was, just use your elbow and just say, hey guys, will you let a colleague in here? And I only had to do it once. But I did have to do it. And I also described the ways in which, and this is still very much a thing, that I made choices about what I wore and how I presented myself and how I prepared for things, all in an effort to convey what I thought my physical self was not conveying, which was authority. And one of the things I confessed to is having taught myself to swear, because it's not what, I didn't grow up doing it. It was totally how the men in my field operated. And I decided that I had to do it in order to be taken seriously. And I still do it. I'm not making this as a recommendation, maybe more as a confession of the kind of changes that I felt I had to make to who I am in order to convey what I know. And when I say this kind of stuff in front of my daughters who are in their 20s, they totally roll their eyes, which is great. And they are much more in a place of, they don't really feel like they need to transform themselves in order to convey who they are and what they know. And I consider that a great sign of progress. And maybe this is a generational thing, but I am not sure that we're there yet. And one of the women that I interviewed for the book, who's a wonderful professor at Howard Law School, African-American woman, who still dresses when she's teaching in person, which she isn't right now, she still dresses in hose and heels and as a lawyer, because it's very important to her to convey to her law students, who are almost by definition African Americans, that her in that field, how you present yourself physically, in her view, has an impact on whether you would be successful. And it's it. I don't. I was about to say I think that's more true for women than it is for men. I'm not a man, so I don't really know, but I suspect it's more true for women, and I feel it as a woman who's short, and as a woman who has recently, let my hair be its own color. A year ago it was brown. I feel it as an older woman now with white hair, because people make assumptions on the basis of how you look, and they make assumptions about what you know. And my whole career have felt very aware that I have to work double time to convey what I know through this small and now white-haired body.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing such a personal story as well. I want to follow up on that, and then I know Nigella has a question as well. Were there points in time, either one or various points in time, where you went from the I must swear, I must elbow, I must do these things, to perhaps the rest of the world can now change to adjust to the Cecilia style of way doing things? And I had mentioned to you, I studied computing, and in my world, I remember in the early days, I was, I have to, also send around funny emails using binary code, and like there's certain memes I have to learn. And it took this one grad woman who just said to me, "You don't have to do that." And and I can remember just that clear moment and thinking, "Oh yeah, well, why do I feel like I have to so much fit in with like a certain criteria of people?" Are there moments like that or people like that for you that really helped shift the narrative of that?
Yeah. I'll give you two examples. One was when I was getting ready to leave the White House. So by this time, I've been the president's domestic policy advisor for 5 years. I'm the longest person ever. I'm first Latino in that role, the longest person ever to serve in that role. And I'm thinking about, well, what am I going to do next? Because I haven't really looked for a job in 25 years. And Melody Barnes was a wonderful woman who was my predecessor as domestic policy advisor. She's an African-American woman. And she kind of leaned forward and said, you know that you're not your 25 years ago self, right? Like, that it's different now. You have experience that people are going to value. And it kind of hadn't occurred to me. So that was an important moment. And then I think I've finally realized, and really only recently, look, I've been at this work for 30 years. I know what I know. I feel confident in what I know. I talked myself and was talked into by friends who believe in me into writing a book, overcoming the little voice in my head that said, "Oh, what do you have to say that's going to matter to anybody?" And I realized I do have something to say that matters to, in particular, hopefully to women and to women of color, especially. So I finally realized, all right, this is, I've amassed a lot of experience and I know what I know. And maybe if, somebody assumes that someone who shows up in the world with kindness is only 5 feet 2 inches tall, and in this case now he has white hair. You can tell I think about this a fair amount. If, folks decide not to take that person seriously, I might not need to care so much anymore. But I say those things because I am very aware of the times when folks didn't take me seriously, when they assumed kindness meant weakness or lack of seriousness. In Washington, that happens all the time. And so I try to be honest and forthcoming about these things because I think a lot of us go through this. And I don't think we talk about it. And I think the more time we spend having the conversation, sharing our strategies, but also reminding ourselves and each other that we maybe don't have to care so much, and maybe we can start valuing more what we bring to the table, that the world will be a better place. I mean, the book is called More Than Ready, not just because I think we're more than ready to lead, but because I think the world is more than ready for what we bring.
Yeah. Thank you. Nigella, I know you have a question as well. And for folks on the call, if you want to also raise your hand, I'll track that and I can bring you in to ask your question live as well.
Cecilia, thanks so much for all you shared. I know you talked about you had very strong women role models in your life. Can you talk about one or two really important lessons that you learned from them that you continue to use in your advocacy work or your leadership work? Whether like, what sometimes do you remember if you're sitting in that meeting and people might not understand the perspective that you're bringing to the table? What are one or two lessons that really stick with you?
Yeah. The first example I have to give is my mom, who my parents were immigrants from Bolivia. My mom didn't have a college education. So she was not formally trained, but she had formidable people skills and knowledge about people and wisdom about people. And I now realize that the skill set that made me really good as the president's domestic policy advisor was the kind of people skill set, the empathy that I learned from my mother. Much more so than whatever policy training I had, whatever formal training I had. She could read a room like nobody else I knew, and understanding what the people sitting around from you need from you in order to get a decision made is the essence of the skill set that made me successful as the president's domestic policy advisor. And that's a quality and a set of skills that I learned from my mom, who did not live to see me work at the White House, but would have been completely gobsmacked by that fact. And even more so by the notion that she possessed a skill set that was useful in that role. So that's, I think, my biggest example. The other example I'll give, which I think is tremendously important, and that's of my colleague and friend Valerie Jarrett, who was the highest ranking woman in the White House other than the First Lady herself, and set a very clear tone that we were going to watch out for each other as women in the White House. So, that there's a familiar situation where, people kind of elbow each other out of the way for primacy or authority or for attention or for whatever it is. And she set the tone very early, like, we're not going to do that. That if we are invested in our sisters being successful around the table, that's going to make the whole enterprise successful. And she modeled the behavior that she hoped to elicit in other people. And I think I found there was a lot of power in that.
I'm just reflecting on all the women who've shown me that kindness can also equal strength, and that setting the tone for that in the workplace can really make a difference for all those around you. So thank you for sharing that. Margarita, I brought you in for you had a couple comments in the chat, but I thought they were really insightful comments. I wanted to just also bring you in just to share your comments, and you both clearly know each other. So
we go back a long way.
Would you like to share the comment and also the hashtag that you shared?
Sorry. Hi, Cecilia. It's so nice to see you. Cecilia and I go way, way back. I was unfortunately leaving National Council of La Raza shortly after Cecilia arrived. We overlapped briefly, but I left there to come to Harvard for law school. And then our lives continued to overlap through work with children. But I think what I mentioned first was this organization, I'm gonna butcher her name, Joy Buolamwini's Algorithmic Justice League, which I actually learned about listening to the TED Radio Hour. And then I went, of course, got home, and I was in the car and I got home and I looked up her organization, and she's just brilliant. And I am not a technologist at all. I'm not even a policy person these days, but I just think everybody needs to listen to her TED Talk, whether you're in tech or not, because she brings to technology all these issues that Cecilia you're talking about, and helping people to understand what is really going on here. And anyway, she just seemed very wise. But I had the what did I say? The hashtag, Cecilia, you said, we're not waiting for someone to create the app to save America. And I just said, hashtag the app that will save America. And could somebody please get on that? One of you tech people.
Yeah. I brought you in because I feel like we so often will hear about some new, even despite all the technology failures, some new app that is meant to save vaccines, save COVID, save the pandemic, save the immigrant, like save all these things. And I just thought Cecilia would have so many either anecdotes or insights into different versions of that you might have seen.
So I mean, in some ways, the most important thing I've learned is that if you start from the premise that you're going to build the thing that's going to fix the problem, you're almost 100% doomed to fail, in the sense that the answer is not actually the technology. Sometimes the answer is actually a very small thing. I just came out of an event with one of my colleagues, and actually I noticed Marina Nitze who is one of the technologists I most admire, who's participating today, who I think it was Marina, her team, who found that in one case, the thing which actually helped solve the problem was a staple, because people needed to fill out a form that was 2 pages long and they were missing the second page. And the innovation was, if you staple them together, folks were actually going to get both pages done, right? So the key, the essential ingredient is to start with the problem that you're trying to solve and the people for whom you're trying to solve it, and then figure out what they most need. There are times when that will lead you to a technology. But if you start with, oh, I see this problem over here, I'm going to build a thing that's going to fix it, and then I'm going to try to get it into the hands of people who need it, is just massively less effective. So that if, like, I've learned one thing from the technologists around me, it's that, like, you starting with the people is a much, much clearer pathway to being successful.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Margarita, for your question. Ariana, you have one more question, and I think we might have to just answer yours by reading yours out loud. Ariana, would you like to share your question?
Hi there. Thank you for this conversation. I've not had the chance to read the book, but I will be running to my local bookstore to grab it right after this conversation. But I kind of wanted to just add a question on top of the question that Nigella asked you. And I'm curious to hear, as the first woman, as the first Latina in a lot of the spaces that you've occupied, what did you turn to, or who did you turn to for that kind of professional development, or kind of asking questions in kind of occupying that space?
Yep.
I'm in civic technology and recently graduated and work with an organization called Coding It Forward, but I struggle to find Latina mentors. And so it's really incredible to occupy this space and to be able to bring other students into this space, but it's still kind of like, who do I turn to when I'm the only one there?
Yeah.
And not to say I haven't had incredible mentors. All the folks in the space are so incredible and I'm so appreciative, but I'm just curious to hear about your experience.
So one of the strategies that I developed, which the other women I interviewed also developed, was to actively seek out sources of feedback. Most of the mentors when I was developing my career and my life were men, and they were awesome, generous, wonderful men. There just weren't a lot of women in my field. And so, like, one of the things that helped me survive the experience in the White House, which was an extraordinary experience, but also really hard, was I was really active in creating safe spaces for others around me, and active in seeking safe spaces where I could seek feedback. So Valerie Jarrett was one of them. I knew that I could go into her office and close the door and say, oh my God, that meeting that I just came out of was a catastrophe. And can you help me see where I went off the rails? And I knew that she would tell me. So in looking for feedback, it was important that I find safe spaces, people who wouldn't hold it against me that I was asking, but also people who would be truth tellers as opposed to cheerleaders, because I really needed the information to know how to up my game. Like, it was too important to get it right. So I wanted people who could tell me things that might not have been easy to hear. And those people didn't need to be people that I reported to, or even my peers. Sometimes they were people who worked under me, but who watched me in action and who could see where I was being effective and where I wasn't being effective. So seeking out those safe spaces, but then also creating them for other people, it turned out to be very effective for me. And being relentless about asking for feedback. And I learned not to see it as a sign of weakness, but really as a sign of strength. The notion that you're able to admit to yourself and other people, like, there's stuff I need to know in order to up my game. I mean, there's no one on the planet who doesn't have stuff that they need to know in order to up their game. So there's no shame in asking. But there were definitely people who it was safe to ask, and definitely people who it was not.
Thanks, Cecilia.
Thank you.
Inez, would you like to go ahead and ask your question out loud?
Hi, congratulations for your presentation. It's very nice to see you, as I am also a Latin person. My question actually is, how are your suggestions to bring this discussion to a large audience and in more organized and in powerful way? Because I think we have discussion in academic space that is so important, but I think we have to bring this discussion larger. And so my question to you is about this. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. And it's something that I struggle with a little bit. I mean, I think again, I just came from an event with my colleagues who've written a book on public interest technology. And I think we are actively trying to expand the spaces where this conversation happens. I think this isn't a fully formed idea, but among the things I'm learning is that it's essential to tell stories that help people understand what it is that we're talking about. The minute we say the word technology, people assume they know what it means, and they make assumptions about whether they do or don't understand it. And neither of those things turns out, I think, to be accurate. I've learned, I tell, as Marina Nitze knows, I tell the story of her work on foster care in Rhode Island all the time, because it's a story which illustrates how applying her engineering skill set, not by engineering something, not by like creating an app, as we've talked about, but rather by investigating a process, in this case, the process through which people became licensed as foster parents, and fixing what was broken about a process turned out to be really impactful. That story, the reason I tell it all the time is because it's an illustration of what it is that we're talking about that helps people understand. Like, they may not understand what the skills of an engineer are or feel like they can relate to them, but they do understand being in a bureaucratic government process that's very frustrating and doesn't get you all the way through. We've all been through that. And they understand the solutions that she came up with because they're common sense solutions. So I think one key to taking this conversation more broadly is storytelling, is making sure that we can describe it through experiences that people can relate to and understand.
Thank you so much.
Oops, Kathy, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. And on that note of storytelling, since we're right at time, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your own story, but also weaving through how you got so much done and how you impact the field of nonprofit, politics, policy, technology in such a senior role in the federal government, and now building out a whole new movement in public interest technology and making space for so many more other people, and also sharing all the challenges as well as all the people who uplifted you as you got here. I know for me personally, being able to read those stories just have really helped me this past year as well. So thank you for More Than Ready. Thank you for being here with us at the Shorenstein Center. And for those who want to learn more, there's Cecilia's link as well as Twitter account. And thanks for everyone for just spending time with us during a time like this. I know it's hard to find time during these times to get on even more Zoom. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Nigella, thank you. Kathy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia.
All right. Bye, everyone.